A long time ago, think like 1500s Renaissance era, a long time ago, composers started getting a little bit bored with some of their chord progressions. So they came up with something kind of cool. So say they had a really simple progression, like a D chord into a C chord. Now, rather than just play the D and then hop over and play the C, they started taking the top note and the bottom note and moving those over first. So they'd wind up with this kind of intermediate chord here. They'd let that play out for a second, and then they'd finish the move by moving that middle note over the rest of the way into their C chord. And that middle chord, that sort of transitional chord, that became known as a suspended chord. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So I'm going to show you basically three things with this chord. First, how to play it. There's a couple different variations, so I'll show you those, but it's really, really simple. Then I want to show you some of the basic ways of using this chord, kind of the simpler uses, and then I want to get into some of the more advanced things. These chords, even though they're simple, they're actually very strange and different than a lot of normal chords, so they do some very odd things, and I want to talk about that. So, there's actually two different variations of this suspended chord. There's what's called the suspended fourth, and a lot of the time it's written like that. Like if you see this on guitar music or something, you might see G sus4, something like that. That's a G suspended fourth. So the way you make this chord, you have a root note. For making a G, the root note would be a G. And then you're going to have your fifth, just like most other chords. Find that. And then you're going to have a fourth right here. Now, I'll assume you know how to find a fifth at this point. If not, you can watch the basic chords video I did a long time ago. But you'd start on a G. Here's your fifth. Now, to find your fourth, you could actually just count up, but the easiest way is to just look at your fifth and then go down a whole step. That's real easy to see, and there it is. So that one's really easy. If you did it somewhere else, we'll do a harder one like a B chord. Have a B, go up to your fifth, go down a whole step, you have a B suspended fourth chord. Now, the other kind is what's called a suspended second chord, or sus2. This one's a lot less common. If someone says suspended chord, they're usually talking about this one, not this one. If you wanted to, tell someone to play a suspended second chord, you would have to say that explicitly, like play a suspended second. But let's say a E suspended second. So for this one, E is your root note. You're still going to have a fifth. And then here you'll have your middle note would be a second. I mean, it's all in the name. So say we're on E, go up to your fifth, go up a whole step from your root note, and there's your second chord. Did a different one like a C suspended second, look just like that. So these chords are really easy to make and play. The formula is like almost contained in the name, so there's really nothing to that part of it. But the interesting part is, what do you do with these? So the sort of traditional way of doing it was what I just showed you, like going from one chord to the next and using the suspended chord as this sort of intermediate chord. Now what's kind of interesting about that is that the suspended chord works as this sort of tension chord. It's a bit odd sounding on its own because it has this major second interval, which is pretty different than the normal chords that would have like intervals of thirds. So it sounds a bit odd. And it kind of generates a little bit of tension. It almost sounds like it resolves into the C chord. So that's kind of the traditional way to use it. Now, in the Renaissance era, they would always start on, they call this preparing the chord, but they'd start, one chord higher, move the two notes over, kind of transition into the suspended chord, and then they'd finish the transition by moving a middle note over. Now the suspended second chord is really the same idea. It's just coming from the opposite direction. So in the sort of Renaissance times, they probably would have done that chord, say, going from C to D. So they would have started on a C chord, moved the top and bottom notes, wound up with this suspended second right in the middle, and then finished the move by sliding that middle note over. So you could use it in kind of the same way. For both these chords, you could do that sort of prepared move where if you say you wanted to go from an F chord to a G chord, you could use that G suspended second in the middle and then finish the transition. Or you could just kind of play that chord out of nowhere. You could play a G suspended second, and then kind of resolve it into that G major chord. And that's kind of the traditional way to use them, and it's still the most common, is using them as these kind of tension chords that resolve into this chord that they're right next to. Like, using G suspended second to resolve into G major, or G suspended 4 to resolve into G major. It would work for minor chords too. Now, the suspended fourth chord is much more common, and I think it's probably because it just has a bit of a stronger resolution sound to it. The suspended second just isn't quite as convincing. So you may find in your own music that you tend to use the suspended fourth more often. That's what most people do. Now, to get into the more advanced use of these chords, you have to kind of take a step back for a second. If you really think about one of these, like let's take this G suspended fourth for a second. This chord is actually really strange when you compare it to all the other chords that, at least that I've talked about on my channel. We've gone over major chords, minor chords, diminished, augmented, all different kinds of seventh chords. But in every case, those chords, or all the notes in them, were related by thirds. So just a G major, for example, these two notes are a major third apart, 2 whole steps. There's 1, there's 2. These two notes are a minor third apart, whole step and a half step, whole step, half step. And every other chord worked like that. Didn't matter if it was a G dominant 7 chord, same thing here. These are still a third apart. A diminished chord, everything's a third apart. Augmented, every single one of those. Everything was always a third apart. But these suspended chords, they are not. They have a middle note that is a fourth away from the root note, and it's a second away from the fifth, or in the case of the suspended second chord, it's a second away from the root, and it's a fourth away from this fifth here. Now you might think, okay, so what? Who cares if they don't follow that rule of thirds or whatever? I don't care about that. But by not sort of obeying that logic or that rule of thirds, they do some strange things. Part of the reason why all those other chords were related by thirds is that if you started stretching the notes apart too far, or squishing them together too much, they became a different chord. Here's an example. Say you have just a C major chord, right? These are related by a major third. These are a minor third. If I move this one up, I'm still okay. I have a C augmented chord. This is a major third. This is a major third. But if I move this note a little bit farther, if I kind of go past a third and I make it a fourth, I have this chord. Now there's nothing wrong with this chord, but it's not a C chord anymore. If I start shuffling notes around, if I start inverting it, I take this A and I move it down, I can see that what I'm really playing here is an A minor chord. It's just inverted, right? An A minor chord, if I take this note and put it up here, I get this chord, which looks kind of like a C chord, but it's not. So by relating things by thirds, we make sure that chords it's always clear that they have a root note and they have a sound to them, and it doesn't matter if you shuffle them around or move them or do what you like. You can always tell that this is the root note of the chord and this is the sound that it makes, or the other notes that fit around it. Now, in the case of these suspended chords, since we're not following that rule of thirds anymore, we don't have that. So back to this C suspended fourth, for example. Look what happens if I try to invert it. Say I take this G note and I move it up an octave. If I'm playing this chord, I can't tell that this is a G suspended fourth anymore. This looks exactly like a C suspended second. So these two chords here, if you start inverting them, they look like each other. There's no way to actually tell which one you're really playing. So when you actually go to play one of these chords, the sound it makes is not very clear. It doesn't have that very clear root note and then, note grouping or sort of sound around that root note. It could go either way. It's very ambiguous sounding. And in addition to that, since the chord doesn't have a third in it, we can no longer tell if it's a major chord or a minor chord. It doesn't really apply in this case. For example, say we're in C. If I play a C major chord, I can tell that I'm in the key of C major. If I play a C minor chord, it's clear that I'm in the key of C minor. Either one of those chords, if I know that C is my root note, either one of these very clearly define the key. But in the case of a C suspended fourth chord, this could fit in either key, and so could the suspended second. I can't tell if I'm in a major or a minor, so I have even more kind of ambiguity to the sound. But most people describe these suspended fourth chords as being open chords. They don't have a strong sense of major or minor to them. They don't even have a strong sense of root note because you can invert them and they sort of morph into different chords. Now you can use that ambiguity to your advantage. Let's say you're in G, right? And you play a G suspended second chord. Now you can't tell if I'm in G major or G minor. It doesn't really apply yet. If I then move to a D suspended fourth chord, still can't really tell which key I'm in. I could move then to a C suspended second, still can't tell, and then I could go back to a G. And there's nothing to give away whether it's a major key or a minor key. In fact, trying to say major or minor doesn't really apply here because I haven't created either one of those sounds yet. So that sort of open, floating, ambiguous sound can be something that you want and something that you kind of really go for. But you do have to be careful with these chords. If you use them in the more traditional sense of just kind of setting up some tension and then resolving them into another chord, like G suspended fourth into a G major chord, you're never really losing that sense of tonality. At all times, you really know where the music's at. But if you use them in this more advanced context, you lose this sense of what key you're in and what the center is. The chords can be inverted and you can't tell what the root note is. All that can be really cool, but if you're not intending to do that, it can kind of mess up your music, or it can cause it to do things that you weren't expecting and you might not like. So it's important to understand the full implications of these chords. So just to sum up all this real quickly, suspended chords fall into two categories. There's suspended fourth and suspended second. Remember, suspended fourth is by far the more common one, and if someone just says, hey, play a G suspended chord, they're almost definitely talking about this one. You can use them in a more traditional way where you set up tension with them, like playing a C suspended fourth and resolving it into a C. You could go the opposite direction. You could play a C suspended second and resolve that into a C. But remember though, that's not quite as common. Or you can use them in this more advanced sense where you can kind of use them in ways that cause the music to lose its sense of tonality or center. You can play around with, am I in a major key or a minor key? You can't really tell. But if you don't understand what the chords are doing, they can be really surprising. It can cause your music to do things that you really weren't expecting. So guys, I think that's it for suspended chords. Let me know if there's any interesting things that you like to do with them or anything I didn't cover. I plan on doing a lesson on key changes. In fact, that's what I was going to do this week, but I haven't yet figured out how to mount my big stage piano to my desk. So I'm working on that. And as soon as I do, that's probably going to be the next one. That seems to be what most people were asking for. So thanks again. Let me know what you thought, and I will see you next time.